We're thankful for the good things the Lord has done. And He's done many, many good things. If we'll just take the time to open our eyes, listen with our ears, and understand with our mind and hearts how wonderful God has been. So if you've been following the Sunday school lessons, which I have, you'll know that we're in the last few chapters of Samuel and going through David's life, book of Samuel. King Saul, starting with Samuel, of course, and then into King Saul and David. And you read the stories and you think, this is a neat story of Samuel, neat story of Saul, neat story of David. But the reality is the Bible is a book about God. It's God's story. It's not the story of David, it's a story of God. And God's dealing with people, and God's working with people. And the main point that I'm getting out of this is how far God will reach to work His perfect plan. Chapter 30 in 1 Samuel, "And it came to pass when David and his men were come to Ziklag on the third day, that the Amalekites had invaded the south and Ziklag, and smitten Ziklag and burned it with fire." Now David had gotten himself into a predicament there with Achish, the king, Achish of the Philistines, and was treated fairly nicely by the king. The king felt that David had been on the outs with King Saul, which he had in a couple of years since he dealt with Saul, and realized he could not trust Saul no matter what Saul said or no matter how contrite Saul seemed to be, that there was just that impulsive, jealous spirit that invaded Saul, and David realized he couldn't trust him. So he went to Achish, the Philistine king, and Achish gave him Ziklag, and Ziklag is where he and his men and their families dwelt for the last couple of years. Well, he got himself into a pickle because the Philistines were gathering together to go fight against Israel. And the king said, "David, come along. You're here, you're one of us now. Let's go fight the Israelites." And David was kind of playing both sides of the fence there, gave him kind of a non-committal answer. He said, "Well, king, you know how good I am. You know what I can do." Yeah, we know what he could do. He was a man of war, but fortunately for David, sometimes we get ourselves into predicaments, don't we? Sometimes we say things, do things, go places, make promises that all of a sudden we realize that was not the best thing I could have done. I should have done something different, and now I'm in trouble. Now I'm in a rock and a hard place. And David's there with the king heading into battle, setting up the battle to where they all meet, and all the other princes of the Philistine city, 5 major cities, and they all gather together there to fight Israel. And the other ones look over and say, "Isn't that David?" "Oh, yeah, that's David." He said, "Isn't that the one that they said, Saul has killed thousands and he's killed 10,000s? And yeah, that's the one. We don't want him here. We don't want him behind us and following behind the armies." He said that he could turn on us. Well, Achish didn't think so, but anyway, because of the pressure of the other kings, the other princes of the cities there and of the armies, "David, you'll have to go back home. You just, not my choice. I'd have you here, but this is what the other ones say. So you've got to, sorry about that, but you need to go home." So David and his men, which he had about 600 men at that time with him, turned around and went back home. 3 days later, they finally get to Ziklag, where they were stationed, and I'm imagining that they probably were pretty tired, pretty hungry, pretty worn out. If they'd been part of that army, they left all their provisions back with the army because they were going home, and they could get lots of food and provision and rest there at Ziklag. Unfortunately, while the Philistines were gone to fight Israel, the Amalekites in the south thought perfect opportunity to go raid a few towns, to go get some spoil, to go into the towns of the Philistines and Ziklag of David and take what we can. And they did. And it says when David came up, he saw that the city was on fire, that they had actually burned the city of Ziklag, taken everyone prisoner. Men and, women and children, all the men of war were gone. The Amalekites were not kind. They were not merciful. The men of war were gone, so they didn't have to kill anybody, but they just took them all prisoner. And they would either make them slaves or sell them off as slaves. So no mercy with the Amalekites. They were there marauding and pillaging. And David inquired of the Lord. I mean, he was upset. The people were upset. The soldiers were upset. We turn our back for a minute and look what happened. And they just gave way to all kinds of crazy notions, crazy ideas. Eventually looked at David and said, "It's your fault. We ought to stone you for the Amalekites raiding Ziklag, for sending us off on this wild goose chase with the Philistines." But the point that came to me is that it says David was greatly distressed. Of course he was. His family's gone, his people are gone, everything's on fire. But it says, this is verse 6 of chapter 30, but David encouraged himself in the Lord. David encouraged himself. When you and I reach a point where there are things that are just troubling us, and rightfully so, intentionally so, deliberately, we are troubled by things, legitimately troubled by things, we have a choice to make. We can let our fancy run its full course and just get upset about things and just get all tied up in knots of being upset and discouraged and angry and all these things, like the men following David did. And because of those things, it just leads them to illogical and silly conclusions, like David's at the fault for all the Amalekites raiding the city. Or we have a choice. We can go and encourage ourselves in the Lord. Seek God's grace. Seek His strength. Seek His guidance, His encouragement, His direction. David encouraged himself in the Lord, and he was able to influence all the people away from him and say, "Hey, let's go get those Amalekites." Listen to what he did, though. David said to the priest, "Bring hither the ephod." And David inquired at the Lord, saying, "Shall I pursue after this troop?" Well, you might think that's the most natural thing in the world. Of course he's going to pursue after. What else are you going to do? You're going to pursue. But here's the deal. This is the story of God. How God found David a man after his own heart, because David, even though the pathway was obvious, even though what he needed to do was just as plain as the nose on his face, yet he took the time to inquire. He took the time to pray. He took the time to ask God, "What should I do here? What's the course that you want me to take?" I think that is the secret of success for anybody here tonight, and for anybody that comes around our way, is to seek God's will and ask Him, "What would you have me to do?" Well, a few chapters earlier there, and I think it was 23, the Philistines had actually went down to Keilah. They fought against Keilah, and they robbed the threshing floor. And David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I go after them?" And God said, "Go." And then the men that were following David, well, they weren't so sure. They were thinking, well, we're 400, 600 people here, and the Philistines are like, the grasshoppers, the sand of the sea. Are you sure about this, David? David had inquired, and God said, go. But you know what David did? He prayed again. He inquired a second time. I think it pays for us to keep our ears open to what God is saying to us. We may think, oh, we got the message and this is the way to go, and so we should, but we need to keep our ears open. Listen to God and inquire. If it takes a couple of times praying, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, if you can pray and have peace with God about what you're going to do, about the direction you're taking, and you can pray again and you still have peace, and you can pray again and you still have peace about that, I think that's a pretty good sign that God is directing you in that way. Look at Abraham when he prayed and God said, I want you to sacrifice your son Isaac. And Abraham took him up. I mean, Abraham had faith. He counted that God could raise Isaac from the dead if he needed to, because God said that's the child of promise, and from him all nations of the earth will be blessed. Abraham knew it. It was a done promise, a done deal. That was it. But yet he said, sacrifice Isaac? Okay. I don't understand all of God's plan right away, but I'll do my part. I'll walk in the light as God gives me the light. I imagine Isaac was pretty glad that Abraham kept his ears open to what God was saying. God told him what to do, and Abraham moved forward to do it. But then, of course, at the last minute, God spoke to Abraham and said, No, I understand. You're faithful. You will do exactly what I've asked you to do. Don't touch your son. Don't put your hand on it. Thanks, Dad. I appreciate you listening to what God has to say and not just, blindly going forward. So there's the ram in the thicket over there. Abraham sacrificed the lamb, and the story goes on. David inquired of the Lord a couple of times, even though he knew this is the direction you're supposed to go. And David listened, and God told him what to do. And he did what he was supposed to do. He pursued after, in this case, he pursued after the Amalekites, came to that brook, Besor, and 200 of his men were too tired to move forward. Look how merciful God is. God does not ask us, to do things beyond our capacity. As Paul wrote, he doesn't take what we do not have. He asks for things that we do have. And these men, after 3 days coming back from the front, probably nothing to eat, very little, probably marching day, night, trying to get back, then pursuing the Amalekites. There were 200 of them that were they couldn't move forward. We're sometimes like that in our spirits, in our physical, that we just don't have the strength. But look how merciful God is. Come unto me, ye that labor and are heavy laden. I'll give you rest. He'll give us strength. He'll give us grace. David told his men, stay there. Stay with the stuff. And the rest of us will pursue. 400 people left going to pursue the Amalekites, but God gave them a great victory. There was the Egyptian slave that they found by the wayside, basically abandoned by the Amalekites because he had gotten sick a day or two earlier. And the mercy of God. Just a wayfaring man, half starved, half dead by the side of the road. They've got things to do. Sometimes we have things to do. Sometimes we have places to go, people to see, things to do, and there's an angel unawares. You know what I'm saying? There's a blessing right there of somebody that's going to take time away from our all-important mission. And that's what David found there, that Egyptian. And he's pursuing the Amalekites, but yet here's this poor man. He didn't know whether this man was any help for him or not. He didn't know what the guy was. He was half dead, could hardly talk. But they gave him water, they gave him some food, they revived his spirit, and they said, "Who are you? Where are you from?" We should never excuse ourselves from doing what's right when God gives us the opportunity to do it. We should always make the effort to do what is right and to help and to be a blessing. And maybe we've got other things to do, and maybe we've got important things to do. But if God brings a person or a blessing in your life, and it's your opportunity to minister to them, to give grace, to show love, then we ought to do it. God knows the end. God knows what you're up to and how important things are for you. And God thought it best to bring this individual along the way. And so he did. And look, an angel in disguise. Here this young man was an Egyptian, a slave to the Amalekites, and he said, "If you don't kill me, I'll show you where the Amalekites went." God blessed David with this unknown individual that took them right to where the Amalekites were. David fought, had a great victory there, brought back everything, everybody and everything, plus a little extra, that he could be charitable. And he was. At the end of the story, or at the end of the chapter anyway, it shows where David came back to the men that stayed with the stuff. He made it an ordinance that no matter what, who stayed behind or who went out to the battle, why all people shared equally in the spoils. That was fair. Yeah. That was fair. You need people to stay with the stuff while you go out and do the work. Amen. And then he also sent to them in the area of Judah, to the various cities that had been blessed by him, and he had been blessed by them for keeping him safe, and sent portions of the spoil out of his own share to share with them. Listening to God. That's the main thing that came to my mind when I thought about this story, listening to God. Yes. And I heard Rachel's testimony. It reminded me, she had Jim and Marcy Johnson. I had Ollie and Dottie Talley, Marcy's brother Ollie, and come to our place when I was 13, came to California there and was witnessing and telling us, this was probably 1970 and 1971, witnessing and telling us what God had done for them. It had to be 1971, so that's when Ollie got saved. So telling us what God had done for them. And I remember sitting out in the backyard there. Everybody else had left, the rest of the family. Mom didn't have time. The family had broken up, and we were on the verge of moving to Florida. And so I'm listening to Ollie and Dottie, and they're telling me about the gospel. And you know what? It sounded good. It sounded good to me. It sounded like something I wanted. And we were there way after dark for an hour or two as they were telling me about the Lord, what the Lord had done and what the Lord's going to do. As it turned out, that was the end of that. We moved to Florida for another till I was 18, and came out here. You know, the Lord was good to me. Lord was good to me. I came out here when I was 18, right after graduated from high school, and was sitting in the house there with Ollie and Dottie, and I was scheduled to go back to Florida because I'd signed up for the Coast Guard. Why not? Where else are you going to go? So I came out here for a 2-week visit, and sitting there, we went to camp meeting, and God sanctified me, filled me with the Spirit of God, And I came back to Ollie and Dottie's house here in Medford, and sitting there at the kitchen counter, I was reading the Bible, and the Lord spoke to me. It was that chapter there in Matthew where he says, you know, if you're going to build a tower, don't just sit down first and figure out whether you have enough to finish it or not. Yeah. It says if you're going to go out to war, don't just sit down first and figure out whether your army has enough to beat the enemy, the opposing army. Yeah, you do. And God said to me, he said, I don't want you to build your Christian life in Florida or in the Coast Guard. I want you to build your Christian life right here. And that was a big deal, because I wasn't scheduled. It was completely different than what the plans were, completely different than what everybody understood. But yet that's what God said. God said, stay here. I was up at Little John Talley's funeral Saturday, and we were talking with Stephanie Reed. And she didn't have Jim and Marcy or Ollie and Dottie. She had John. John Talley and Colleen were the ones that invited her and her family up to camp meeting and here to Medford where she got saved. But she had that similar testimony that she came here from camp meeting, came back to Medford, Oregon, and God said, this is the place. This is where you need to stay. And she called her folks and said, not coming home. I called my folks and said, well, my mother anyway, and said, not coming back. I'm here in Medford. I'm staying in Medford. And, you know, by the way, could you call the Coast Guard for me? And she did. And I guess I wasn't enough trouble to come out to try to get me. But the Lord's been good. Listen to the Lord. Listen to what he seek his face. Inquire in his temple. Ask him what he wants you to do. You may think I already know what I need to do, but listen anyway. Pray again. Ask God, can you just direct my steps? Show me if what I'm doing is right, then give me that peace about it, and I'll keep moving forward. But if there's something else, why, Lord, you show me. And God will. He's faithful because he loves us. He loves us. He's looking for people whose heart is pointed towards him, who's open to his direction, people whose heart is saying, I want the Lord's will every day, no matter what. 688 is the song we're going to sing. Let's come out to the altars, give thanks, ask God for his direction, and believe that God will do things for us.